It's a good thing when we are disappointed with God, disappointed with Jesus, when he doesn't meet our expectations, because in that moment we have the opportunity to close the gap between what we expected and what was real. When there is that gap, we recognize that our expectations were wrong and we need to adjust them to reality. But here's what we're tempted to do. We're tempted to fill the gap between our expectations and reality. We're tempted to fill it with falsehoods. It is much more tempting to fill the gap with what we're familiar with than to change our perspective and our expectations to what is real. And oftentimes, we will think that we're fixing it by filling it with falsehoods. And there are plenty of people who are willing to give us falsehoods to fill in the gaps. But that just makes us more likely to collapse. That just makes us more likely to believe a lie. Let me illustrate what I'm trying to say to you. How many of you remember the Minneapolis bridge collapse? It was August of 2007. I would have never guessed that it was that long ago. But in rush hour traffic, cars just slowly making their way across the I-35 West Bridge outside of Minneapolis over the Mississippi River just suddenly collapsed. Over a dozen people were killed. Over 100 people were injured. Multiple cars, trucks, and even a school bus on this bridge that collapsed into the Mississippi River. When that collapse happened, it wasn't that no one knew the bridge was in bad shape. They were actually working on the bridge in those moments. If you look at the pictures of the collapsed bridge, those shocking photos of a collapsed bridge laying in the Mississippi, you can see orange barrels where they were doing work. They knew that the bridge had problems and it needed to be made structurally sound. They were working on it in those moments. But what they did in doing construction on it is they brought 300 tons of construction materials onto the bridge. They added to the weight that this weakened bridge was holding up. And one of the contributing factors to the collapse was all of the stuff they brought on it to fix it. And I'm afraid that many times, instead of fixing the gap between our expectations and reality, our hope of what God's going to do and what he really does, instead of fixing that and bringing our expectations in line with who God really is, we try to fix it by piling on all of this falsehood, piling on these verses and scriptures out of context, piling on these prophecies that sound good to us, even though they're not true. And all that does is bring on the collapse. When we have filled our hearts and minds with things that sound good but aren't real or aren't true, we lead ourselves into greater dismay. If in that moment John the Baptist had propped himself up with, well, hopefully Jesus is going to set me free soon. Hopefully, if he had propped himself up with hopes and dreams and aspirations that had no basis in reality, he would have been setting himself up for major, major disappointment. Jim Collins, in his book, Good to Great, he talks about the Stockdale paradox. Stockdale was this leader who was a part of the group of soldiers captured and kept in the Hanoi Hilton. And Jim Collins asked him how he led these soldiers to remain hopeful in the face of years of captivity as prisoners. And he said, well, you had to always believe that you were going to be freed, but you couldn't hope in something that wasn't real. You had to constantly believe that you were going to be freed, but you also had to be brutally honest with yourself about the facts. He said that fellow prisoners who constantly told themselves, hey, we're going to be home by Christmas. We're going to be home by Easter. We're going to be home by July 4th. They were constantly disappointed. They would set these hopes and dreams and goals on things that had no basis in reality. And when that came and passed, they were disappointed. He said, we maintained our belief that we would one day go home, but we were brutally honest about what we were going through. John the Baptist maintained his belief in Jesus, but he wanted the brutal, honest, real facts. And maybe they didn't line up with what he was hoping for, but it was real and it was true. And what we find in God's word is not what we want to be true, but what is actually true. And if Jesus has never disappointed you, if God has always agreed with you, if the God that you worship in your mind has always believed exactly what you think he should believe and done exactly what you think that he should done, you don't believe in God, you believe in a God of your own making. And Jesus has not invited you to follow the Jesus in your head. He's invited you to follow the Jesus who really is.